Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications.
Well, Ro, it is great to have you back. You have been quite the traveler this past week. We had I saw you in the Bay Area for the subject of this week's podcast, our great talk by Kevin Hassett, but you jetted off to Washington for what seemed like the hot ticket, the Heritage 50th Anniversary Gala. So tell us all about it. What did you see? What was the buzz back there?
It is the 50th anniversary this year of the founding of the Heritage Foundation. And they had, not only did they have the gala, but they had several events surrounding the gala. So they had what they called a leadership summit, where they had various panels and some really prominent speakers, potential presidential candidates. They had Tim Scott, they had Ron DeSantis, and they had some others who are focused on more cultural issues. But you know what struck me, Tim, about the Heritage Foundation? I was very happy and excited to be invited, but they were really trying to pave types of issues that the conservative movement will be focusing on in the months and next few years to come. And Kevin Roberts, who is the president of the Heritage Foundation, said these are the two issues that Heritage is most concerned about, that these two are existential threats to our nation, which is wokeism and identity politics. And the second one would be China. You know what I wish? I wish we had another Ronald Reagan who could bring together all of these conservatives, whether they be socialist conservatives or free marketers or free traders, people who wanted a strong defense, evangelicals and religious conservatives. We were all under one big tent, and he was able to make it work. And so I kind of long for those days.
Well, that's very interesting, Ro, and certainly well put. But, I would say there's room for all of those issues in the broader conservative movement. And I think one of the things about PRI is that we certainly play to our strengths. And so while, Heritage may be focusing on those issues, we're going to be focusing on the very important, really pocketbook issues that all of us in California are facing, from these crazy energy mandates that we're seeing, that you're going to hear a lot from us in the coming weeks about how, they want to charge you your electric bill based on your household income, to all the issues of crime in California, and all the issues of, whether our kids are getting the education they need to get a good start in life and be a success in whatever career path they choose. Those are all important. And then certainly taxes and spending and economic policy. Those are all very important issues as well. And we're going to continue to do the important work on those issues.
So, Tim, while I was away, there has been some intrigue going on in Sacramento about single-payer healthcare. How about filling us in?
Well, that's right. So while you were away, we had the first hearing of SB 770, which is the kind of new approach to single payer in California. That if you listen to our past week's podcast with Sally Pipes, we talked about the bill in depth. But it basically is what she has called a stepping stone approach to single payer, whereas the state would go and negotiate with the federal government first and try to get the waiver to spend Medicaid and Medi-Cal dollars in California on a state single payer plan. And it was a very interesting committee hearing in the Senate Health Committee. The bill passed. I wasn't surprised by that, but I was surprised by what turned into quite a bit of theater on the bill. So there has broken out a food fight over strategy on single payer healthcare. So there are two bills in addition to SB 770. There is AB 1690, which is the CALRA bill, which is kind of a repeat of the single payer bill from last session. That's traditionally the approach. Well, the main proponents of that bill are the California Nurses Association, and they came to the Health Committee hearing and they vocally opposed the Wiener bill, SB 770. And a lot of their allies and very left-wing supporters of single payer opposed the Wiener bill. Now, as I mentioned, it's still passed, but it's a very interesting food fight. Senator Weiner called it a temporary family feud. I wonder if that's the case. Is it smart politics to try a different approach to the issue? Probably, because obviously the prior version of the bills haven't gone anywhere. But it portends to me that there's going to have to be a real come to Jesus meeting of all the supporters of single payer to agree upon a strategy, or else there's going to be real trouble with the coalition moving forward. And these bills may meet the same fate as the prior bills. So we will see. But it was definitely entertaining theater to watch in committee. And if you're a Democrat, you're wondering, well, which of my key supporters am I going to offend here with your vote?
Thanks, Tim. And if our listeners want to get more background on these bills, check out last week's podcast with Sally Pipes. So it's coming up, our next gala in Southern California, and our keynote speaker is going to be Art Laffer. And many of you know that Dr. Laffer popularized the Laffer curve. He was an economic advisor to President Ronald Reagan, as well as Donald Trump. And as we all know, he's a tremendous speaker. He's funny, witty, and I think we can ask him a lot of great questions about whether we are in a recession or aren't we in a recession, or if not, is one coming up. So we hope you can join us, and we'd love to have you. It's May 11th. That's the evening, Thursday evening at Costa Mesa Weston in Orange County. So hope to see you there.
And to kind of whet your appetite for the great discussion that Dr. Laffer will certainly have at our event, we present to you our event that we held last week with Kevin Hassett, who, regular Fox viewers will see him all the time. He's quite a frequent guest on the Kudlow show with Larry Kudlow. And he was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Trump. And he is, as far as folks who have the background and who have the street cred on all these economic issues, there's no one really better than Kevin Hassett. And gave a very interesting talk, certainly on some of the craziness of California and the policies of California that are driving up costs. We drive into a lot of other interesting questions too about cryptocurrency. What should the future of that be? How should we kind of approach those issues? How do we kind of address these, the drift towards socialism, especially toward young people? So it's a really interesting discussion of, kind of all of these economic topics that we're all thinking about. So, stay tuned. If you couldn't be there, this is the next best thing to hear a really wide-ranging discussion with Kevin Hassett on all things related to the economy.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And here's Kevin Hassett.
And thank you all for coming and supporting PRI. When I think of PRI, I don't know if there are people here who have seen the Lord of the Rings movies. But there's this time where basically they go up against the gates of Mordor, which is where all the bad guys are. They have all these orc things, which are people that look like the kind of old people you see at the Democratic convention, and it really looks hopeless. And then Aragorn rides up and down. And he says, the day may come when the courage of man fails, but it is not this day. And I think of that scene often when I think about Sally and PRI, because PRI is at the gates of Mordor here in California. And the reason why I absolutely have to come if Sally asks me to is because there are very few people left in this world that fight. And PRI is filled with people who fight. And in fact, aside from Sally, I kind of think of PRI as Wayne's World, so it's a real honor to be introduced by him. But it really is true that California, sadly, very often is kind of like the way you would forecast future American policy. And if you think about California policy right now, it's a fait accompli for you guys. I feel bad for you. I live at Hoover some of the year. But it's really scary to think that this is stuff that's going to spread. And if it doesn't spread, and there have been times like this before, I can remember there was good Jerry Brown and bad Jerry Brown, and the point is just that we've fought this fight before. California's been really crazy in the past, pre-Ronald Reagan's governorship, and very much subsequently. And all those bad things that could have spread to the rest of the country, very often, if you go back and look at why they didn't spread, is because of PRI. And if you go to the website, which I like to do, because I'm supposed to think about, mostly I do federal policy, like the kind of things that the crazy people might come up with, then how you would respond. Then you go to PRI and there's stuff every day. There's new stuff every day. And so as an example of like a California thing that I've really dug into, so now I don't know if you guys have put a paper out on this, but I will talk to you so that we can do this. I got really obsessed with the ban on natural gas stoves. And we're going to talk about a lot of other things, but I got really obsessed with it, and I just want to talk about it for a minute. And we're recording and we're going on the internet, and all you out there that think we should ban natural gas stoves, you're idiots. And if you listen to me for a minute, you're going to recognize it, and then you can come and apologize. But here's the thing that got me thinking about it. So first, I love to cook. My wife and I divide up the tasks, and I'm like, food is one of my tasks. She has way more tasks than I do, but the food, I love to cook. And I have a stove that one of the secrets to cooking is you got to get it really hot. And in fact, I'm going to now give you a cooking tip because it's in the evening and we've all been eating. But as an example, if you want to cook a steak so it's just as good as you get it like the palm, then you take a cast iron pan, you put it in your stove, you turn your stove as hot as it'll get, like 550 degrees. When the stove is that hot, you take the cast iron pan out with a really good mitt. You put the steak in there, and then you put it under the broiler for 4 minutes, and it's cooked perfectly. But the pan has to be really, really hot. And that's something you can do with a gas stove, but you can't do with an electric stove because the gas stove goes above 1,000 degrees, the flame. So the idea that they would ban this gas stove is something that kind of annoyed me in the sense that as a chef, I really want, or not a chef, it's as an amateur chef, I really want a gas stove. And yet California is banning gas stoves, even for restaurants where okay. So, but I get to thinking about it because this is what, this is what we scholars, Sally and Wayne and I, what we do is when something doesn't make sense, you don't just stop there. You just basically can't stop thinking about it. And that's why Sally did all this brilliant work. This is the first time I remember reading Sally. We just talked about it, that my memory was correct. As I get older, my memories aren't always correct, but this one is correct. The Bush prescription drug benefit was not financed, and it was a bigger financial commitment than Social Security. And I remember learning that stuff from you, back in the day. And that was because Sally was obsessing over the prescription drug pen, and she taught us stuff that we didn't know. I've been obsessing over the gas thing. And I get to think of it, well, how do they get the gas to my house? They have a pipe, right? It comes up to the house. It brings the gas. What happens if the pipe has a leak? Well, then they send the fire department, they send the gas guys. God willing, if not, the thing explodes. And so you have to, I don't know, in California, they tolerate a lot now. You go downtown San Francisco, there's a lot being tolerated. Maybe they tolerate gas leaks as well. I don't know, but probably not. And so what it means is that when they get gas to your house, that it's actually perfectly efficient because there's no leakage. If there was leakage, then there'd be a problem. And then when they ignite the gas, that's really efficient too, because have you ever looked at a power plant that burns fossil fuels? What they do is they make a flame, they boil water, they spin a turbine. That's less efficient, right? And okay, so I start looking at it, and it turns out that the truth is that people are saying that we should in California ban natural gas because of nitrogen dioxide, which is a gas that gas stoves produce because they're above 1,000 degrees, and so the air above 1,000 degrees makes it NO2, if you remember your chemistry. But the real reason is climate change, right? That people want to stop the consumption of fossil fuels. That was in Joe Biden's plan to save America, or whatever he called his campaign platform, was we're going to end fossil fuel consumption. And so they want to stop burning fossil fuels, but in order to if you don't have a gas stove, you need an electric stove. And if you have an electric stove, then first the food's going to not taste as good. But second, you've got to produce the electricity at a power plant where you're burning natural gas. And then if you burn natural gas and then you put it into steam, you turn it into a turbine, you make it electricity, then there's actually quite a bit of loss of energy because there's friction in the turbine and things like that. But then you ship it over a power line, which reduces the electricity's from the point of origin to the point of receipt by 20 to 40%, depending on how far you're going. You think it's even higher. I looked at the data and it was 20 to 40%, but it was probably because the towns in California I was looking at had power plants that were really close or even in the middle of town. But so let's say 50%. Are you happy with 50? Okay, so what it means is that if you care about climate change, then you should oppose the ban on natural gas stoves because you consume so much more fossil fuels if you have to deliver the energy to cook inefficiently as opposed to supremely efficiently because there's no leaks. And so I'm starting to get like mad at the liberals who want to do this. But then I went from mad to furious. And the reason I'm digging into this is that it's an example that I wanted to make to all of you about, you could sort of think that the PRI does really national stuff. Sally's testifying in DC like 10 times a year, maybe, or more. But the local issues are really, really important. And then I look at why they say they're doing it. And this is an example of, if I wrote a study for you, an example of the studies, you go to PRI, it's filled with studies like this, which teaches you these things. Then they say it's because of air quality, because of this nitrogen dioxide. But then I get to thinking, well, let's go read the literature. And so I read a massive amount of literature, and there's this like supremely, I would say, I guess dishonest, you never know if someone's just being stupid or if they're lying, but there's a supremely incorrect Berkeley study that says that gas stoves poison the air in houses, and they look at NO2. But if you look at the study, then what they do is they put a gas stove in an airtight room, and they turn it on high for 2 days. I'm not kidding. But then if you look at the indoor air quality thing, it turns out that indoor air quality is a crisis in America, that childhood asthma is skyrocketing. And the reason it's skyrocketing is that energy efficient homes are airtight. And that when you cook, like I do, in a really hot stove and you don't turn the fan on, then there's all these volatile organic compounds and fine particles that go into the air, and they cause childhood asthma, they cause lung problems for people. And if you look at the literature, it says that if you turn on the fan on top of your stove, then you really reduce that stuff. But if you want to completely eliminate it, when you turn on the fan, you need to crack your window because the homes are so airtight that the fan can't actually blow air out. Okay, so why am I saying all this? Is that, so if you actually really cared about human health, if you cared about indoor air quality, if you cared about all those poor kids who are suffering with asthma, I had childhood asthma, it's really awful. You feel like you can't breathe and you're going to die. And those people are getting that because no one has told them, hey, you know what? Don't ever cook without putting on your fan. And by the way, crack a window. And if you don't have a fan, open a window. And the literature is filled with science that shows that if you do that, then your indoor air quality is going to be fine. And instead, they're out there fighting against gas stoves, which is one, going to make climate change worse in terms of CO2 emissions, and two, it's hiding the ball or distracting people from something that's a genuine health threat. And now you ask yourself, what kind of a person would do that? What kind of a person would care more about like their religion of climate change than the health of kids with asthma? And the point is the person from California. Okay? And then I look at what California's doing, and then I look at what's happening in Washington right now, and I basically see that there are people that are doing the same things. And so thinking back, and by the way, I'm going to go till about 8:30, and then Wayne and I are going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to take questions for a long time, and then more questions at the bar, I think is the way we describe it. But if you go back and look at the Trump administration, and hello, Internet, I really hope you're looking. We are taping this. So let's think about climate change. So what we did is we went in and we deregulated like crazy. The president ordered us to do it. The CEA and the OMB one of the things, Council of Economic Advisors, Office of Management and Budget, one of the things that if you're outside Washington, you don't necessarily know is that every regulation in government has to pass a cost-benefit test provided either by the CEA or the OMB. And we took that responsibility really seriously, which basically took the bureaucrats in Washington and it's like snuffed them down the drain. So we reduced regulations dramatically. There was an explosion in fossil fuel production in the US. We became a fossil fuel exporter. But most interesting is that because of allowing fracking and building pipelines, going back to the gas stove, then we had a massive increase in the supply of natural gas. And natural gas is a really climate-friendly fuel. And natural gas replaced carbon, or coal, which is really carbon. It replaced it. And so therefore, during the Trump administration, the US was the country, whether you measure it in the aggregate or per capita, that reduced its CO2 emissions the most on Earth. And in fact, do you remember the Clean Power Plan, the President Obama plan to address climate change that was tossed out as unconstitutional, which it was? That if you look at the Obama administration's simulations of the positive effects of the Clean Power Plan, the Trump gain or reduction in CO2 was dramatically larger than that. And so we outperformed the Obama administration's policy by switching to natural gas. And we also made the US richer. And now suppose, and this is why I really like Greta, right? I'll give her the Nobel Prize every day. Because the thing that she notices, if you look at the anger that climate activist has, it's not just pointed at Republicans. It's pointed at the Democrats who really don't take it seriously. They just use it as a political weapon. And in this case, so if you really cared about climate change, and we had the biggest ever reduction in CO2, bigger than any country on Earth, and if you look, Sweden, France, they have carbon taxes, and we outperformed them on climate. Then if you cared about climate, wouldn't you at least be curious? Wouldn't you at least ask the question, gosh, why did that happen? What can I do to make that effect bigger? Or if I'm going to take natural gas away, then how do I make sure that CO2 emissions don't go up, which they've done under the Biden administration compared to the trend. So that's one thing they care about, right? The left, the income inequality is the next thing. They care about climate, they care about income inequality. So let's think about income inequality. You might remember that we had the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And you might remember that I was on TV all the time talking about the economics of it. And when we first started, I went into the Oval and we were talking to Gary Cohn and the president and I. We were talking about what happens if we pass the tax cuts. And it's something that I spent my career studying is taxes. And so I get really excited and happy when I talk about taxes. I'm the only one, except for now the $85 billion that are hiring people at the IRS. They like talking about taxes too, but only because they get to put you in chains. But we were talking about it, and I had this economic model, and I showed it to the president, and I said GDP goes up by 5 to 10% over a decade or something like that. And he says, I don't want to talk about GDP. Give me something better. And then I've done a bunch of academic work on how corporate taxes are really good for blue-collar workers, because it turns out that if you have more corporate jobs, then you bid wages up. And it was an empirical paper with Aparna Matter, and we showed that the corporate tax cut, if you use our parameters, would increase, I told the president, increase the wage of the average American in their annual wage by $4,000 to $8,000 over about 3 years. And President Trump said, okay, so we'll take 4,000 because I don't want to underdeliver. I believe your range. And so our talking point is that the wage of blue collar workers is going up by $4,000. Do you remember that? Yeah. But it really happened because he said, President Trump's like, get out of here with this GDP nonsense. I am not talking about GDP. And no one knows what GDP is. I don't think most economists know what GDP is. So now we can look back, and if you look back, then right before COVID, the wage of the typical American worker that it went up $6,200, which was exactly between the 4,000 and 8,000. And in fact, if I went to Sally and I said it's between 4,000 and 8,000, you'd have picked 6,000. You would have, you probably. And so the interesting thing though is that if you look at the detail, the wage of people in the bottom 10% of the income distribution in those really 2 years after the tax cuts were in effect before COVID, that went up 10%. And the wage for the top 10% of the income distribution went up like 5%. And so the benefit really did go to blue-collar workers in the way that we said. And here's the astonishing thing. So remember what I said is the left cares about climate change. They care about income inequality. So a show of hands, but not really. It's too late to make you do calisthenics. But so if you lift wages at the bottom much faster than wages at the top, what happens to income inequality? Does it go up or does it go down? Now you laugh, but those people that are going to watch us on the internet, if they want to attack us, are going to not know the answer to that. Because once again, the most important thing in the world, where's Thomas Piketty when you need him? Okay, the most important thing in the world is income inequality. And I gave you a policy which people, I was introduced on CNN once. They quoted another economist who I won't name, when they said, who is Kevin Hassett? He's at the White House. He's going to talk to us about the Trump tax cuts. And then they quoted a liberal economist who said, Kevin Hassett is either stupid or a liar or both. And that's how they introduced me on CNN. Yeah. But that's the kind of stuff that I was getting when I said, no, we'll get $4,000 in wages and it'll benefit the people at the bottom. But fine. That maybe there's some other story other than the thing that's based on, the 30 papers I wrote on this topic over 30 years. And many other people have written papers on this too. Maybe there's some other explanation. But once again, if the only thing you care about is income inequality, and then you saw that there was this guy who you didn't like and his tweets were offensive, and gosh, it was like the way he acted towards the John McCain funeral was something that upset people justifiably. That he's not a perfect guy, but like maybe, and I have a lot of Republican friends that are really don't like the idea that President Trump might be the nominee, even though they like his policies. But if you think about it, that the left claims to embrace objectives that were accomplished by President Trump, so they should love him. They should nominate him. He's the best thing in the world for climate change. He's the best thing in the world for income inequality. And that's a joke. They don't really. I know they would never do that. But once again, where's the curiosity? So you only care about income inequality. You have this thing called the Gini coefficient. I don't know, maybe you've seen it now and then, but it's like the measure of income inequality. The Gini coefficient dropped after the corporate tax cuts every year, which means that income inequality, by the best measure that academics have, went down, and nobody's writing a paper about it. You can't read about the decline in income inequality back then in the New York Times. And the policies are being reversed. And so what kind of person does it take to ban natural gas stoves, even though it makes climate change worse, and then makes you talk about something that's going to make it so a legitimate problem with childhood asthma is unaddressed? What kind of person says they care about income inequality, and then when it finally goes down after all these years, remember that real wage growth under President Obama for 8 years was zero, and we got $6,000 into the pockets of the typical American family. What kind of person looks at that and doesn't want to at least think about why it happened? And maybe you could come up with some progressive way to accomplish those things. God bless you if you could. If you did, I might even support it. But instead, they reverse it. They reverse it. And so then ask yourself, so why are they like that? Why are they like that? And I think that the answer is that we're living in a time of a Manichaean struggle, which means basically, you've maybe heard the word but don't remember from undergrad times what it means. But basically, there's good and there's evil. And there are people that want to do things to this country that are profoundly harmful to our country. And they're willing to abuse the power of government to accomplish those things. Witness the legal abuses. You see the things about President Trump, but like my friend Peter Navarro, who I disagree with about taxes, he claimed executive privilege, which was what we were counseled to do by the Justice Department, career people, when they wanted to talk to him about January 6th, because he was a presidential advisor in the White House. And then the Justice Department is prosecuting him. I told Peter, by the way, if he's worried about going to jail and then pursuing this all the way to the end, he should just become a business partner of Hunter Biden. But the thing is that the people who say they care about climate change but then don't do it, who say they care about air quality but don't actually address the problem, that say they care about income inequality but ignore the fact that it goes down, that those people are also abusing the power of government in a heinous way. And an example, I've seen it so much with so many of my friends, is that Peter Navarro should not be prosecuted for refusing to go to Congress and talk about the private advice he gave the president. That's in the Constitution. It's actually the briefing you get on White House ethics from the career people at the Justice Department. He was just doing what he was told, and for exercising executive privilege, they're torturing him. Peter's probably spent $1 million on legal fees to defend himself, and they're doing that to many of my friends. It's happening to everybody, and you see it especially happening to President Trump, but the point is they're abusing the power of government. So we've got people who disregard the welfare of American citizens, who abuse the power of government. And what is it all about? Well, what it's all about is that the left is using narratives that are drummed into the heads of people at places like Stanford. You saw that what's going on at the law school, to acquire political power. And then they're abusing the political power to harass their political enemies and to enrich themselves. Again, watch, I'm an economist, so I'm not going to talk about it, but watch the stuff that the House is now uncovering about the fact that there are actually 9 or 10 Biden family members that were getting money from the Chinese. And that's so why do they care so much about power? It's not because they care about climate change. It's not because they care about income equality. It's because they care about power. And this is the story of my book, The Drift. And I'm going to say it really quick and then talk about how the economy's doing for a second, and then we're going to open up. But when people ask me about The Drift and where the title comes from, one of the things I like to say is that there's a question in my mind whether the drift is a noun or there's like a drift that's a verb. I drift. I'm on a drift. And I think that the drift in my book is a noun. I think that we're on a drift, like you ever see it, like all these logs stuck together, they're going down the river. Can you stop that? Maybe not. Maybe not. And so what is the drift and where does it come from? Well, I'm going to talk really quickly about some great thinkers of the past and how they saw the time that we live in. And this is really like the point that I dig deeply into in The Drift. And if you watched, I don't know if anyone watched Kudlow today. I am on Larry Kudlow's show every week, and he always introduces me as the author of The Drift, the most important book of the 21st century. He does, which is a complete exaggeration. Maybe it's the most important book that I've written in the 21st century. But here's the story, and I think it's really, really important. And it starts with something that I always teach graduate students, which is that you should never trust a theory that's ex post. And so if somebody looks at the data and says, well, here's the explanation, then don't trust it. You got to wait and see if that explanation works the next time the data come out. But if somebody gives you a theory, 20 years before the data come out, and then it matches the predictions of the theory, then that's actually pretty interesting. And suppose I told you that Joseph Schumpeter, the person who wrote Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy, that invented the idea of creative destruction, basically said, writing in the 20s and then published in the 30s, he looked ahead and he said, capitalism is going to sow the seeds of its own destruction that's going to turn into socialism. And then and it was a 700-page book, writing in the 20s. And here's what he said. He said that capitalism really works. It's way better than central planning. And so the US is capitalist right now. And so we're going to grow really, really quickly. And it's going to benefit all Americans. In fact, income inequality is going to go down. And when he was writing in the 20s, he said, if you look at the 1970s, we're going to be unbelievably richer than we are today. Income inequality is not going to go up. It's going to be great. And he even gave numbers, and they almost exactly matched. But he said, then what's going to happen at some point as we transition to being wealthy, as we get like into the 60s and 70s, is that since we're rich, then Americans will no longer need their children to work the farms, work the shop, stay at home. Instead, we're going to send them to universities. And the universities are going to be like divinity schools for socialism. He said that in the 20s. And then he has a whole chapter, which like you could buy the book and just go to this chapter, about why professors are socialists. And the reason that professors are socialists is that they, you might have noticed, have very high opinions of themselves. And so if you think about how much more worthy and grand, you know, a typical tenured person over there is than you in their mind, then how unjust is the society that would make you so much wealthier than them? That's the basic conclusion. I mean, there's a lot more interesting stuff. And so then those guys teach the kids. But what Schumpeter said is the reason why, he really said this, and when I say it, when I talk about the book, people sometimes get chills. You're going to get chills. So he said this. He said that the professors are going to control the top universities. They control Harvard and Stanford, and he probably didn't mention Stanford because it was new. But if he saw ahead to the 70s, he would have. And so therefore, they're going to control the media because the best guy from Harvard is going to run the New York Times. And through the media, they're going to control politics. And so they're going to have so much control that, and this is the thing that he said, almost exactly like this, they're going to control respectability itself. And so if you're a person who will defend free enterprise, then you're either stupid or a liar or both. And that's the way it is. And so he said that capitalism will die because there'll be nobody left who will be willing to defend it because the personal costs will be so high. And so Schumpeter. Hayek. Okay, so Friedrich Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom at a really interesting time in American and British history. But basically, let's look at America because his book really wasn't a sensation until he came to America. And then they were stunned that everywhere he went, that there were like thousands of people showing up for his lectures, and he sold millions and millions of books. I think 10 million in the first year that he was doing it. But it was an interesting time in America because if you think back to World War II and what you know about it, that basically all the governments around the world centralized. Remember you had to have like a food coupon to get food, and the government controlled everything, and the government took over manufacturing. Although there's this great book by Arthur Herman, Freedom's Forge, which you should look at because it was actually less centralized than you might think. But the socialists saw an opportunity. And so globally, the socialists said, well, we just won the Second World War by centralizing production, so we should just keep it that way. And we really might have, except that there was a backlash of like people in both political parties who remembered how we got here and respected the idea of free enterprise, built in institutions to defend us against socialism, and we saved the day. But in part, a lot of it was because of Hayek's thinking, where he basically showed in his book that socialists become, every time, like he went through a number of historical episodes, they become brutal and totalitarian. And his whole book is really about why that is. And there are actually a lot of reasons in the book, but I don't want to go on all night, although I'd love to. But we have a Q&A period at the bar if you want to learn more about Hayek. But I think that basically Hayek's view was that socialists, there are a lot of people who think, geez, I feel so bad for people who are less well off. I really want to help them. The way to be sure I'm going to do that is to have the government take some money from Wayne's World and to bring it to, the poor person. And then so they actually are well-meaning, but that doesn't work because, as Margaret Thatcher said, you run out of other people's money. And so that kind of person can't keep power, according to Hayek, because they're going to try something that doesn't work. And so the socialist that can keep power is the one that's willing to abuse the power of government to brutalize their opponents. And that if you look at the history of socialist nations, then they wander from a place where there's a rule of law to a place where you have an attorney general like we do right now that should be impeached, should be put in jail for the abuses that he's engaged in. And it's not just him. It began with President Obama when they used the IRS to harass political organizations or Republican organizations or right-leaning or free enterprise organizations. I can remember at the American Enterprise Institute under President Obama, we were audited every year. And you were too, probably, right?
We weren't, but Heritage and many of my friends were. We were probably too small, but yeah, it's true.
Yeah, well, not anymore. But the point is just that that's like Hayek's vision. And if you look at what's going on now, it's going to get worse if they keep power because they can't keep power without being abusive. And so then, is there hope? And so the third thinker that I talk about in the book that gives me hope is Marshall McLuhan, of all people. And people like if you're old enough, you remember seeing Marshall McLuhan on TV, and he was kind of like Andy Warhol. That when he spoke, it kind of was intriguing, but also didn't make sense. But then the more you think about it, I've grown to love Andy Warhol more and more as I go back. You should go to YouTube and watch some Andy Warhol interviews. They're astonishing how clever he was. But McLuhan was that way too. But the thing about McLuhan that I find most remarkable, and remember Hayek wrote that they're going to become more and more totalitarian, and you would have to concede that the Democrats have become more and more socialist, and they've been abusing the power of government in a way that Hayek anticipated. Well, what McLuhan said was that he before the internet existed, he decided to start theorizing about what the internet would do to society. And he said approximately this. He said, "You're going to get the chills again." He said, well, right now we live in a curated society. That if you want to get information about what's going on in the world, and it's outside of your own world, then you get it from the New York Times, you get it from Dan Rather. And so that there are people, liberal elites, that Schumpeter talked about, although I don't remember McLuhan citing Schumpeter, who control the information, who curate your life. And that gives them an enormous amount of power. And there's a reference to the fact that when the printing press was invented, then over the next decade or so, 20 million books were in print. After only 10 years, the printing press, and almost something like 80% of the books that were in print had previously been banned by the church. Everybody wanted to read what they weren't supposed to read. The church lost its control over information. And McLuhan said, this is what's happening once the internet happens. Because instead of there being a curated society, there's going to be a competition, a global village, he called it. You could just Google McLuhan Global Village if you want to read more about this. And in the village, you go to the town square and then you talk to people to try to figure out what's going on in the town. And in the internet, you just basically go on the internet and you look for things that are going on, but you don't necessarily look in one place. And in fact, there's a competition for attention. And then McLuhan got a little pessimistic, and he said, the problem with the competition for attention is that the sort of crudest and most offensive people are going to get the most attention. I don't want to say that that's like a perfect description of President Trump's Twitter account, but President Trump is a genius and understands it at the competition for attention. I can say that I like him very much. I worked very closely with him, and he's a much different person in person than he is on Twitter. But he wins the competition for attention But then, and here's the part where you get the chills. McLuhan says, so, but then what happens next? What happens next is that the elite that lost their power will recognize that if they, and this is the way he said it, the two words he said, if they organize their inattention, then they can get their power back. And so what is organized inattention? It's kicking someone off of Twitter. It's organizing inattention. It's making sure that the person who just won the competition for attention that you don't like can no longer do that because they've been wiped from the internet. So McLuhan wrote that in like the 50s and early 60s. It's incredible, right? And so I would just submit that we're living, and this is the drift part of my talk, that we're living in a world that people saw coming, and that we know how to win this fight. And one of the things is to produce the ammo, like the facts that I told you about climate change and income inequality and all the things that you see at the PRI website. But the other thing is to understand that things like canceling are like the supreme threat to our country that exists. That we've actually, engaged and defeated the socialists a little bit before they basically started using the power that McLuhan saw. And so the final thought is that if you wonder why a person who has such, extraordinary intelligence and vision, that he's built Tesla and Solar City and SpaceX and become the richest man on earth, would buy Twitter, it's because this thing that we're talking about, Elon understands it. He understands it, that he believes that in the idea of America, and he recognizes like where the front line of the struggle is. And so I think I've gotten about to the end of my prepared remarks. What are the rules of, we were just talking about this because we were down in Phoenix at a conference together about late night talks after people have been drinking, is that you really shouldn't talk too much about like the economic data. But if people want to talk about SVB or anything else, we'll save that for the Q&A. But I think, Wayne, you might have had a question or two you wanted to ask me first, or do you want to go straight to the audience?
Well, I guess it's up to the audience. If people have questions, let's go directly to that.
So let's see. We have plenty of time. So does anyone have any questions? Yes.
It might be a naive question, but when you say the end game is power, I'm still not understanding the balance of, if we all go away, they can't live in their glass house anymore. So eventually, by getting rid of us or getting rid of all the workers, like, how can you even have power anymore?
Right. So and by the way, as long as I can hear it, I'm going to repeat the questions, because I know for some people in the back, and I have a microphone, and I'm not going to run the microphone over every question. But the question is, like, if they run us all out of town, then what use is power? And the answer is that, look at California. A lot of people are leaving town, but a lot of people aren't. And as long as you're here, you're paying the highest taxes on earth and being regulated within an inch of your life and watching people in tents sleep in your front yard. And that's the world that they live in. But again, the political power is, in the end, the ultimate goal is not like personal greed because of accident. It's personal greed because, in my mind, of evil. That these people know. There's a lot of smart people that again, how could you care about income inequality, look at the data on income inequality, and then not care? Then you can't care about poor people if they had a 10% wage increase. You can't care about climate change if CO2 emissions went down. You can't care, and it's not just that people are ignoring or didn't bother to look. It's that they're playing a political game for their own political power, because they want to enrich themselves and also probably enjoy the exercise of power. And that if you don't admit that, and that's basically the lesson from my book, is that that's what these people are up to. If you don't admit that and confront it, then you will lose. You will lose. A question in the back, yes?
Could you talk a little bit about digital currency and how the Biden administration is pushing that towards that?
Yeah, so the question is, could I talk about digital currency? And sure I can, yeah. And So the thing about digital currency is that first of all, like there's no one here old enough to remember the 1820s, unless there's a vampire amongst us. But you go back to early American economic life, and say the teens, the 18 teens, there were actually something like 2,000 currencies in the U.S. And so the idea that there should be one is actually relatively novel. If you go back and look at ancient history all the way back to Hammurabi, then most of the time there are all sorts of currencies being used as means of exchange. And the thing about digital currency, there are a lot of subtleties, but the thing about digital currency that makes it so that it's like really here to stay, absent government intervention, is just this: that what are the sort of most what organizations in society have the most market power and charge you the most for the least amount of service? And you'd have to say it's the banks. And then, if you were to try to engage in a transaction, buy a house in a foreign country, then, you're going to have a wire fee on this side and a wire fee on that side and a consulting fee. And last I checked, people think it costs about 6% to engage in a transaction internationally, unless you're a big financial institution that negotiates cheaper prices. If you pay for something with Bitcoin, then there's no transaction fee other than the fee to buy the Bitcoin or Ethereum. And so in the world where the banks are basically harvesting money from you every time you engage in a transaction, if you do the transaction in crypto, then you're basically saving yourself a lot of money. Moreover, if you look at, for example, Africa, what are the reasons why the economy, they have such educated, talented people? If you look at the success rate of Africans that immigrate into the U.S., it's astonishing. It's like absolutely like they converge to being well off here relatively rapidly because their education is so good. But the economy there hasn't really improved much because they don't really have a currency anywhere. But now they do. It's actually like everybody's got electronic currency on their phones. And if you try to use cash there, then when you're traveling, they don't really have rule of law in a lot of places. So if you're moving between towns, then somebody steals your cash. But if you have it like on your cell phone, then they can only basically get your cash if they basically brutalize you into telling them how to get onto their cell phone or something like that. And so the crypto is something that will continue to flourish because it's basically an arbitrage against a really inefficient part of the economy. And it's certainly had a lot of hiccups and so on, but I think in equilibrium, it's still going to be there. And when institutions ask me, should we invest in crypto? Then, or if someone who has a really large portfolio, then I say think of it as like gold. The world is changing really rapidly. It's going to be a big part of it, and you should have a little bit of it because if it really goes up a lot, you want to be part of it. But you shouldn't take so much that if it goes south some, that it's going to really, really cost you. And then I tell like sort of ordinary investors that crypto is something you use, but not necessarily something you own. But when you have a transaction, you should think about using it. Now, one of the things that's happening now is that the Biden administration has begun to go after firms in this space, and it's really like we could go into the nuances of this a little bit later if you'd like in more detail. But one of the things is that there's a dispute between the Commodities Futures Trading Corporation, the SEC, where the CFTC says that crypto is a commodity, and the SEC has yet to say whether or not it's the kind of financial instrument that a security that they need to regulate. They won't say. And so there's a dispute amongst the regulators about what to do here. And despite that, the SEC has launched legal proceedings against people for unlawfully marketing securities, even though they haven't provided any guidance about what's a security and what's not in this space. And so if you look at the behavior of the Biden administration in this space, you would have to say it's sort of disgusting and unlawful, but that's like what they're doing everywhere. We shouldn't be surprised. but why would they threaten companies with lawsuits when the companies are asking them, well, tell us what to do, and they won't answer. And that's the world that crypto's in right now. It's a pretty uncomfortable world, and my view is that that it's part of, like, going back to the Manichaean point, that it's just a shakedown. It's either a shakedown or it's an attempt to please, like the banks had run their competition out. You go back and look at the Chicago School people, they say basically that big, powerful monopolies use government to shut down innovators and competition. And so it's kind of one or the other. It's one or the other, but it's not particularly attractive. And the good news is, though, that the crypto world is so, it's flourishing so much, it's so humongous, and it's so difficult, like if you have VPN to regulate, that I don't think that they can shut it down or maybe even slow the growth. But it is disturbing that you should go look at when Coinbase got the SEC notice. You should go read the company statement. It's basically like, we listed in 2021. They allowed us to list at a public exchange. We presented everything about our company to them, and they approved our listing. And now they're saying that we're doing something incorrect, but they won't tell us what it is. And I think that their letter that they've published on their website is actually really quite informative about what's going on if you're worried about the space. But the point is that it's just kind of like the attorney in New York, the district attorney who's attacking President Trump for this silly thing in the past, that he won't actually say what the crime is. Right? It's because he can't figure it out himself. And that's probably good news for the crypto space, is that if they can't figure out by now what it is they think they're doing wrong, then they probably aren't going to find something that'll stand up in court.
To tie some of your thoughts together, though, then the central bank will want to take over crypto.
The central bank will want to take over crypto. Yes, so that's the threat to crypto. The threat to crypto is that, that's right. The threat to crypto is that people decide that print money, that they don't like competition.
Correct.
Yes, that is the threat. But my point is that that short of putting me in jail and not giving me a computer, that if I want to do a crypto transaction, they can't stop me. Yeah.
So a comment and then a question, but just to follow up on that. So I'm a lawyer, I do securities. 2017, I had a lot of companies doing this new thing with blockchain, doing tokens. And they're all offshore now. and Gary Gensler is basically, like you said, they're regulating through enforcement. So we don't really have any rules, we just have fear of what might happen. So just to add to that. What I wanted to ask you about was, you mentioned Piketty during your talk, and of course he expels wealth taxes to eliminate income disparities. And we're kind of seeing that more and more talk about wealth taxes, especially here in California.
Yeah, I know.
So I'm wondering, is that part of the prediction as to what we might see happen?
Yes, because in a totalitarian government, what happens? So the question is wealth tax. In California, they're thinking about it. Is this one of the things that we could expect to happen? And the answer is, yeah, sure. Because as soon as you have literally the way they're abusing government, they're moving in the direction of being like the many totalitarian governments around the world. And if you're a successful multi-millionaire with a great business in a country where, you supported the opponent of the person currently in power, then they're going to take your business. It's what happens. And so, yeah, I think that taking your wealth, right? So if the Democrats are really, they're going to be the one thing is that they're the party of the wealthy, if you actually look at the data. And so if they really want to take the wealth, then you're going to take the wealth from Mark Zuckerberg, who got you elected, Joe Biden. So I kind of wonder how they're going to figure out how to take the wealth from the people they don't like, but let the people they do like keep it. And maybe they can't do it, which is why we won't have a wealth tax. But the thing I want to say about a wealth tax, though, is that now we're going into technical math a little bit, but it's really important that if I'm giving you a model like the model that gave you the $4,000 to $8,000 of a tax. Then the way to think about a tax on wealth is to get it into the model. It's basically because wealth is a stock and models are about flows. And so you have to figure out what the equivalent income tax is. and capital income tax if it's wealth. And the point is that there's a David Bradford actually at Princeton, who's no longer with us, sadly, great man, has a famous theoretical result that the way you map the two is that you take the risk-free interest rate and multiply it by wealth, and then that's like the income that you need to use when you're figuring out what the income equivalent tax is. In other words, the risk premium doesn't go into the calculation. And so therefore, let's say that the interest rate's 2%, say. Then if you have a 2% wealth tax, it's the same as 100% tax on income. And if the interest rate's 4% and you have a 2% tax on wealth, then it's a 50% tax on capital income. And so the thing though is that the real interest rate is right now it's like 1.25% if you look at inflation protected securities. And so if you have a 2% wealth tax, then it's more than 100% tax on income. And as anyone who's thought a little bit about the Laffer curve, once you get above 100% tax, then you have some pretty serious effects. And you mentioned like all the crypto firms moving offshore. Well, that's what's going to happen to the wealth. Is that everybody's going to find ways to get it out of the country, and it will end up being like China, basically, where you have to go to Macau if you want to get your money out of the country. Are there other questions over here? And I'll repeat it again because it's over here. I'm sure you can't hear.
I'm going to throw you 3 pitches, and you can bring in whatever.
So we're going to throw me 3 pitches, but do them one at a time. Which pitch?
Okay, first one will be BRICS and de-dollarization, Restrict Act, and privacy communication, and last, scaling energy bills to the level of income. That's Newsom's most recent proposal to turn our paradise into hell here.
Yeah. So Gavin Newsom. We'll start with him. Extremely dashing fellow. I honestly though think that he's like the classic example of the demagogue who doesn't care about the harm that he produces. Honestly, making the energy bill a function of your income is the right way to do that. Is that if you think that there are low-income people that don't have enough money to heat their homes, then you give them a subsidy to heat their homes. But to build in progressivity, it invites all sorts of really bizarre behaviors, including moving from California, that will make no sense. The unintended consequences from that, I could go on all night. Sure. Yeah, and the Restrict Act, yep. Which one is that? I honestly...
That's the Trojan horse. Actually, it's TikTok, which is not mentioned at all.
The TikTok bill. Yeah, they call it the Restrict Act.
Restrict Act, which would...
So the second question is the TikTok, the banning of TikTok, but then everything else that they're doing around it.
Yeah, Patriot Act 2.0.
Yeah, so that's very much... So I actually fiddled with TikTok for 2 days, and I found it like it was like, I've never done heroin, but it's sort of like that. Like once you start doing it, then you can't stop, right? So it's a very effective way to, basically destroy the lives of our children. But as a free market person, I'm not sure. I think we should trust parents to do something about that. My own rule, for example, when my kids were growing up, is they can do anything they want on their computer, but they're going to lose their computer if they erase their history. And I can tell if they erase their history. I'm pretty good at computers. But the Restrict Act, it goes way too far.
Yeah.
And I understand the concerns about TikTok, though. And as someone who's been in the White House and had a high security clearance, the Chinese are as bad as you can imagine. And the first question was?
And that was BRICS and de-dollarization.
Oh, de-dollarization. So the last one was if the dollar is no longer the reserve currency of the world. I think that's something that people are talking about. The Chinese are starting to want to pay for oil and renminbi and so on. But I think that if you actually think about it, that the U.S. is a much safer place to store your wealth than any other country still. In Europe, the problem is that like the euro would be a really great safe currency if every country was Germany, and it would have been gone like a decade ago if every country was Italy. And yet they're sort of pasted together.
it's a piece of prosperity. It seems to be the forefront of the new alliance, the Eastern trade bloc that's forming, whereas we're still pursuing interventionist, never-ending wars, and it seems that their focus is on that, and also actually China brokering peace with Iran.
Yeah, so China's on the ascent for sure, diplomatically.
Yeah.
H.R. McMaster gave a really brilliant talk at the conference we were just at, where he talked about how it all goes back to Afghanistan. But I'm not a foreign policy guy. But yeah, I think those are, so is there another question before we finish for them? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just have a question about debt.
So the question's about debt.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one common thing that's between Republicans and the Democrats, that the debt just keeps increasing. Obama left us with shy of 20 trillion, and after 4 years of Trump administration, about 30 trillion. The Biden administration is on steroids when it comes to deficit. We're at about
32 trillion. It went from 26 to 32 under Biden.
It's definitely a common theme. Some economists say that that doesn't matter. What's your position on that?
Okay, so the question is, does the debt matter? And given that the Biden administration has added to like the COVID debt, we now owe $32 trillion. Our GDP maybe will be 26 trillion if we have a good year. And so we owe almost a whole year of stuff. Well, here's some fun, not so fun debt facts. The CBO currently forecasts that we're going to spend $1 trillion a year paying interest on the debt over the next 10 years. The defense budget this year is $800 billion. The corporate tax raised about $400 billion. How much is Medicare?
700 billion.
700 billion going up to.
Right, so interest is
up to
bigger.
$1 trillion, including, and then
Yeah.
Medicaid will be the same.
Right. And so all of this borrowing has basically made it so that we either go bankrupt or we have to cut all the other stuff. And it's a really big problem. And if you want to solve it, and then now I'm going to, since Sally's standing up, I know it must be time to stop. If you want to solve that problem, then you should read Sally's work, because you can only solve it if you go after Medicare and Medicaid.
Right.
Yeah, and she knows, and she really knows how to do it. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and then I'll give the mic to Sally. But thank you so much.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.